So, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on when and where you are in the world and the universe. My name is Gareth Worthington. I am a sci-fi author, but volunteer for the BSFA, and I am very happy today to be here to interview Kate Elliott, who has produced numerous works with interesting stuff. And I was going through the things today and over the last week, everything from lawyer dinosaurs right through to justice eagles, which I think is fantastic and very far removed from my very contained sci-fi world. So really interested to kind of dig in with Kate today to find out a bit more about her and her latest work.
Forgive me. Gareth, thank you so much. I just want to say thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Oh, of course, no problem. It's an honor for me. So I just want to say, forgive me for my dark room. We're on very different time zones. I'm based in Switzerland and Kate is in Hawaii. So we're just basically on other sides of the planet, literally 12 hours apart. So it's cool that we can do this via video link. So, okay, I always start all of my interviews with the same question. I did the same thing with Adrian Tchaikovsky last couple of weeks ago at MCM. Don't worry, it's not going to be scary. It's the why of why you write. I tend to find the why we write drives what we write. And I know obviously that you've been writing since you were 9, and that it was, at the time, I think, an escape from rural Oregon. But really, at this point in your life, why do you write? What's the driver?
Of course, there are many answers to this question. And you're correct that why I write now can't be separated from why I wrote then. So I could flippantly say that I write now because it is literally, after 30 years of writing, the only marketable skill I have at this point. It worked out well for me. I have 3 children. It worked out well for me when my children were small and their dad was working a lot, that I could write and raise them. And I also really hate working for other people. I'm not good in that setting. So it also allows me to work independently. It allows me to work without being around other people. I'm an introvert, although I love other people, but I need them in smaller doses. So those reasons, I can look at those reasons now and say, yes, of course, that's why I'm still writing. It's how I make a living today. But in reality, if I go back to what I was doing when I was 9 and 10 and drawing maps and devising stories. So first of all, I don't even know why some people feel driven to do that. In the same way, I don't know why I see 10-year-old kids who are like cooking, right? They start cooking because they're obsessed with cooking, and kids who start sewing, and kids who carve, and kids who want to get into an engine and take it apart and put it together. So whatever forms creativity come in, and I always like to say that one of the great disservices that we do to children in our society is to tell them that there's only certain ways to be creative, when in fact there's every way to be creative, and many things that people do are creative acts. For some reason, story resonated for me.
Okay.
And I wanted to write stories, and maybe partly it was to kind of get out of rural Oregon in my mind, right? And have an adventure that I wanted to have somehow. But also I just like doing it. I like making up stories. I love making up worlds. I don't know why. It's just always driven me.
No, that makes total sense. I mean, your stuff is huge. I mean, your world building is immersive. It's massive. I mean, you must have notebooks that just line shelves building your worlds back there. I mean,
I do have notebooks, which I mostly put together to keep track of things. I'm not someone who builds a world and then writes a story. For me, the character and the world have to develop together. I mean, in the same way they do for us, right? We can't take ourselves out of the setting and the childhood and the culture or cultures that we came out of. They're kind of like the air we breathe and the water we drink, and then they create who we are as an adult. And to me, when I write, my books, I would say almost all of my books begin with a person in a setting, in a landscape of some kind. And then And of course, I have to figure out where I want to be and what some of the thematic things I want to do are, what the technologies are. Is this science fiction? Is it fantasy? I mean, there's a lot of things going on there, and some basics about what the person wants. But beyond that, in the early stages of writing a new project, I figure those two things out together. Who is this person and why are they this way? And what is it about this world that they're reacting to? What is it about this culture they live in that makes them that way? How do they interact with it? So those two things build together. And I think that's probably what I love most about writing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, another huge theme in your books is really kind of playing with and exploring kind of gender identity, and how that has a role and impact. I noticed that your last book on the Unconquerable Sun. It's interesting because a good friend of mine wrote a book about Alexander the Great, but from the point of view of one of his wives. And that was such an interesting different view on the whole story. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about kind of that last book and kind of why you took that route with the book.
Which wife? I'm assuming Roxanne.
Yes.
Who's the best known of the ones? I mean, just to leave aside the Sun books right now, I will say, this is an easy question for me to answer because I was I'm old, and I don't say that in a bad way or a good way, as just I'm old, and I grew up at a time when, oh God, now I want to make a whole aside about how terrifying all the transphobia is right now, and the U.S. is just everything going on with LGBTQ in the US, where they're trying to push that history aside and make people invisible, and it's terrible. And for the people affected specifically, and in addition, for all of us, and I say that because I grew up at a time where there were more rigid ideas about what a boy and a girl could do. So when I was young, I understood from an early age that there were the books I read that I thought, oh, I want to do these things, and the things that I wanted to do in the world, they were things that society was telling me were boy things.
Yeah.
And then I was like, but I want to do them. Does that mean that I want to be a boy? And I actually had a teacher when I was 12 years old. I've told this story before, so if anyone has heard it before, I apologize. When I was 12, I had a language arts teacher, a young and very savvy woman. So this would have been 7th grade, and she had the kids fill out a worksheet with short answer questions. My favorite food is, and then there were like 20 of them, right? Whatever. And the last one was, I wish. And I wrote, so I'm 12 years old, and I wrote, I wish I was a boy. And she actually took me aside later and said, can you, in a very warm and understanding way, can you tell me about this answer? And it was the first time, I had a great dad and not so great with mom, but this still wasn't something I would have talked with him about. Sure. So I was grateful for that. And over several conversations with her, what I came to understand was that I was fine with being a girl. It was that boys got to do these things. And over my teen years and into my 20s, what I came to understand was that the problem wasn't me. The problem was these rigid ideas of what was boy and what was girl, what was masculine and what was feminine. So I am like very much not into those things, or as a friend of mine says, I'm very low valence gender, right? The gender is not important to me in that sense, right?
Sure.
And so that meant when I started writing, of course, it was seriously in my teens, that I wanted to write stories where girls got to have adventures like boys did.
Yeah.
But without, and then that my understanding of these things got more complex as I began to think about how I needed to not be dismissive of women's lives historically by saying that, well, I'm going to be a girl who's like one of the boys, right? As opposed to saying that these things aren't divided on that axis. That's an artificial division.
Yeah.
So basically all of my career has been wrestling with this, probably this specific question. And that's why I've always written about women and tried to make sure that I write about a wide range of lives, you know, not just women being like men, because that's superior hierarchically, but about women having displaying the wide range of lives that women have always had historically.
Yeah.
You know, even to get back to Alexander the Great and, you know, and Roxanne, and I hope you'll let me know later what the book is, because I'm quite interested. But, you know, Alexander, I didn't find out till I was an adult. In fact, till I was doing research some years ago towards this project, the new project, that he had a half sister who was the daughter of a Illyrian princess who was trained as a soldier and who went to war leading an army, and that it was considered normal in Illyria that princesses did that. No one told me that when I was young, right? So it turned out that all these divisions were artificially created in terms of how we remember things. Anyway, that's my long answer to that question.
No, but that's a great answer. And that kind of gets back to my why you write thing, because it's about that drives your storytelling and what you're trying to explore. So that experience for you very much drives what you're exploring in your books. And that's key for me. I think that makes the story come alive, because you have a personal investment in it, and it's very important to you, you know. So I think that's where I was coming from there. And if you're interested, the book is called Realm, and it's by Alexandra Weiss, W-E-I-S, good friend of mine. And yeah, she likes to explore exactly the same things. So, and I thought it was such a cool take on it. So when I saw your book, I was like, oh wow, you two would get on, you know, so no, I think
we can geek out over all the Alexander trivia.
Yeah, right, exactly. But I mean, sort of moving on from that, and I think it makes kind of sense. So maybe we can talk a little bit about Unconquerable Sun and kind of, you know, that first book, because I know that the sequel's out now, right? So maybe start with the first and move on to the sequel.
Well, they're all one. It's a trilogy, and it's all one story. But yes. But I will say I did try to make each book have a complete narrative sense. So like you can read the first one and say, okay, this is a good place to stop. And the second one is the same. I wrote it with the hope that, I mean, in today's marketing world, right? Yeah. With the hope that if someone happened to pick it up and they hadn't read the first one, they could read it as a complete book. But yeah, I don't know. I can go on for hours about this project.
That's good. I like
as we can, right? Yeah. As we can about our own books.
Yeah. Okay. So the Unconquerable Sun was 2020, I believe, when it came out, and then Furious Heaven has just come out now. April. Would come out in April this year.
March and April. March in the UK Commonwealth, and April in the US Canada.
Okay. How I mean, you know, I don't think you want to give away too much, or how much are you willing to give away about the new book, and kind of how it continues the story?
Well, this project actually started with me thinking about how to turn the successor wars. This is not a spoiler, but in the history, Alexander dies, and then his generals fight for decades. Yeah. They're all horrible people, but great fodder for fiction, right?
Sure.
They fight for decades over the empire he conquered. And I thought for a long time that it would be really interesting to write the successor wars as a space opera.
Okay.
Which gives you more leeway. I felt that I don't actually write historical fiction because it's just not a match for what I want to do. Mm-hmm. But it would go to really mix it up. But then I thought, you know, if Alexander is the ghost on the throne, you know, that they would when after his death, when they would hold meetings, the generals, they would put his armor on his throne so that he was like there in spirit, because his personality and the force of his of everything who he was for whatever reason was so strong, and the legitimacy of who he was, and it was his legitimacy that gave them legitimacy. So they had to they were always using that, right, when to give themselves legitimacy. And I thought that would be great. I said, but if I just talk about this person who I always knew I wanted to gender flip, if I had just talk about this person and say they were so great, then how can you really tell they're so great, right? Sure. And then, so I said, so I really need to start before, and I apologize if this is, again, I would have to start the story before the death of the Alexander analog. Well, once you put an Alexander into a story, they're like, hi, it's my story. Yeah, for sure. And that's what happened. So book one, I call Unconquerable Sun young Alexander. So when there's I actually, in some ways, this is it's adapted, but in other ways I follow the history pretty closely. There's a lot of analog characters, they who may or may not fulfill similar roles. Some of them are pretty strict. There's there's an Alexander, there's a Hephaestion, there's a Philip, and there's an Olympias. They're pretty clearly analogs to the actual historical figures. Other people are kind of mixed in, because you can't, how it is. With history, we can, in a novel, you just can't have as many people as the history really has, because readers can't keep track of all those people. Yeah. So young Alexander kind of, I would say, it follows a lot of the incidents of Alexander's youth from 18 to 22, only it's all compressed into a 3-week period. Sure. Because it's fiction. Yeah. So the main character's son is 2021 in book one, and it has a particular vibe. And then book two is everything expands. And it's more the campaign phase. Yeah. And it's a bigger book, both conceptually in terms of the sheer number of characters and settings that we see, and in word count too. It's also substantially longer than the first book. I don't know what else I would say about it. I mean, I love writing space opera because to me it's a setting. It's a fantasy setting, which doesn't, which means that I adhere as much as possible to my understanding of science, but I can allow things that we can't do or that we may consider to be impossible because it's space opera. Yeah. And cautiously where needed, but it's opera, right? We've got big voices singing on a stage. That's what it's about. Yeah. I have to say, I'm quite envious. I mean, I'm a sci-fi writer, but I'm very much bound to my scientific roots as a scientist by career. I find it very hard myself to kind of eke myself out of, well, that just couldn't happen. So I'm very jealous of that. I'd love to be able to do what you do. I mean, where do you even get your ideas from? How do you go beyond the science and kind of go, well, I'm gonna push it over here and just pull this crazy idea? I mean, lawyer dinosaurs or your giant justice, whatever it is that you've pulled, kind of out there ideas that on paper sound bonkers, but work. They work if you can pull them off, right? I mean, anything can work in a narrative if you can make readers accept it. I think I love a science fiction novel or a fantasy novel for that matter, because there's a lot of technology. I mean, humans have always had technology, and it can either be recognized or not recognized in stories. Ken Liu does this in his epic fantasy series, The Dandelion Dynasty, which starts with the Grace of Kings, and it's really a story about the development of technology, but it seems like a fantasy because it has all the fantasy's trappings. It's actually remarkable, the stuff he does with it, all of which I'm pretty sure, 99% sure, it would be workable if it was done in reality. So I think there's an important place for books that say, I'm going to tell this story with the knowledge I have. I love reading books where I can feel that groundedness
Okay.
in science, in the physicality. In the same way, I want to say that I can tell if, like, if I read a book set in Hawaii, I can tell if someone visited here for a week on vacation and said, oh, this is so cool, I'm going to write about it. And someone who has a deeply grounded knowledge, who
Yeah.
clearly knows Hawaii well. And it is true of any profession, any landscape, you know, a culture. I think I think these books are valuable. I'm thrilled that you're doing the work you're doing. I mean, I could flippantly say that the reason that I can make up faster than light and clearly impossible travel system in my space opera is because I don't know enough physics. So I can just say, well, this sounds good, probably not possible, but who cares, right? It's just, you know, so that gives you that little extra. It's like with the eagles. In reality, because the bones of birds are so light, right? I really don't think they could hoist something. Well, eagles can actually carry quite a bit of weight when they pick something up. I don't know the thrust of their wings. I don't know about that. But anyway, I'm just like, who cares, right? Does it sound good to me?
Yeah.
Do I want it? And can I make people believe it? Would troodons really have survived millions of years after a great ice age and developed into lawyer dinosaurs?
Yeah.
Probably not. But it's fantasy, right?
Yeah.
This is literature of the fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, did Odysseus battle a cyclops?
No. And yeah, as someone who's who's deep into like Greek mythology, I love Greek mythology and most mythology, to be honest with you. And it's those epic stories that stick with you. You know, it's an allegory. You know, it's not like verbatim. That's what happened.
Yes. And that's exactly right. And I think that there's a place both for what I'm going to call realism, where we're really adhering to what we know about things, and for the fantastical, for this like explosion of, you know, an almost a mythic, that mythic sense that we're in the presence of something that is just much larger than we can ever be. And I think to some extent, I'm always trying to grab for that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
For whatever reason, yeah.
I mean, so I'm a big reader of nonfiction, being a nerdy scientist, so I read a lot of quantum physics and quantum biology and all those other things. But I read an author you may have read as well, Yuval Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, and he also wrote 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He's an Israeli professor, and he just breaks down the human condition by pure logic. Really good guy. And in his latest book, he dedicates an entire chapter to science fiction. And his reasoning is that the public very rarely get access to science. They only touch science and the future through fiction. And he said, and there's a place for, you know, good science fiction and fantasy that helps people understand a little better, and then bad science fiction. That's why everybody thinks AI is going to kill us, because all people can think about is Skynet, right? It's going to come and murder us all. You know, so what are your kind of thoughts on, you know, your place in that kind of whole allegory and using science fiction and fantasy to help people a little bit understand?
You know, all cultures tell narratives. I mean, we of course, I like to say that humans are a pattern-making species. We tell stories about ourselves. We tell stories about our lives. We create our lives as stories. And cultures tell stories about who they are. Now, we all know that the United States is a shining city on the hill, that a beacon of freedom for all the people that our empire has conquered, and, you know, the genocides, chattel slavery, you know, which the thing is that shining city on the hill is a mythology. It's the story that, and every empire has done it.
British.
You know, the British Empire they have an incredible mythology. The different Chinese dynasties had, you know, every mythology, the Mexica, the Aztecs, you know, had one as well. That's how empires build. But even societies that aren't imperial do that. And I also read a lot of nonfiction. I read a lot of history. I'm in that sense really more a social scientist. I read, you know, I'm reading actually a lot of natural history right now, things about the natural world and the environment, for whatever reason. Let's go there. But it's You can write a science, one could write a science book and say X, Y, and Z, but it is, for good or for ill, also true that people need, like you say, Skynet is the story, is the narrative people have remembered.
Yeah.
And so I think it's incredibly important for there to be narratives that use science and that use history to tell stories so people, I don't want to say that stories should be didactic and that stories should be educational, because that isn't what their root is. No. But they can be those things, and they can tell stories. If climate fiction, this is a great time in a way for people to write climate fiction, to make people think about what we could do, or to write about how we can change, how we can transform the current kind of what people call predatory capitalism, right? The incredibly destructive economic system that we all, most of us, suffer through, except for the 1%, right? And there's a narrative, but a lot of people, it seems to me, don't see any narrative but that big capitalistic, we got to do profit and individual rights. This is in the US. I can't speak for other countries. If people can't see outside that, then they can't shift their thinking.
Yeah.
And that's what story can also do. And that's the importance of it. And I've been thinking a lot about that, as like, what could I write, if I was looking at another project, what could I write that could talk about ways I think that society could transform to be healthier for the biosphere and for humans as part of the biosphere, so I think narrative has that, without being didactic. Narrative has that option, and it can do that, and it can do it well.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good place for discussion. I think for myself as a writer, I found that, it's easy to be biased. I have a particular view on the world as a scientist, as left-wing, those kind of things. A few years ago, I took on a story, and I wrote with a friend of mine who's a SWAT sniper from Alabama, and he's Christian. And I'm an atheist scientist from, Europe. And we came together to explore what is a soul. And in our book, It Takes Us to Reach a Star. And we didn't set out to tell people, it was to make people think. But what I loved about it was no one thought we should even be friends, right? How are these two guys even friends? They're on other sides of the aisle, but we respect each other. And we felt that was a good narrative to bring to the world. Like, we can have different views and still be friends. And so I guess, to your point about your kind of next book, do you have a thought? Have you thought about your next project, I guess, out of your Unconquerable Sun series, like,
Oh, I'm always like 6 books behind. I'm revising something that has sold, but which I can't announce yet. I'm slowly working on the 3rd and final Sun book.
Sure.
And I mean, I have a whole project that's in the early phases, and then I have some, which I can't talk about, which I don't want to talk about because it's too young. And then, I have thoughts about older worlds. I'm one who tends to go to a new world. They're big though, like I'll write trilogies in them. And some of them are related. The Crossroads trilogy was followed by the Black Wolves trilogy, which isn't, well, anyway, I don't want to get to that. No, that's one of those publishing nightmare stories. Anyway, but, and there's things that I might want to go back to and write another story in, now that I'm old, right? I can do that as kind of like a reflection. Because it's actually occurring to me. See, one of the things about writing is that art is a lifelong journey. And so the things I wrote when I was 30, I couldn't write those now. So I'm glad I wrote them when I was 30. But I can go back and look at that thing I wrote when I was 30, and I can say, what do I have to write about that setting now? How would I look at it differently? What would I, what aspects of it would I explore now. So that's another possibility. In other words, there's like this constant churn for me of things. I will die, hopefully in a long time from now, hopefully decades from now, not soon. I will die with things unwritten. That's just how it is. And I would rather it be that way.
Yeah,
I don't want to say, oh, I'm done. I've written everything I have. It's like, no, I just want to be, didn't like Bach was halfway through the Art of the Fugue or partway through the Heart of the Fugue. And he I like to think that he collapsed on his score, but I don't think he did. But I love that. That to me is like role model.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, so I mentioned like, I'd love to be able to do the fantasy thing. Your work is so wide ranging. Is there something that's completely off the map for you that you would like to do, like Nordic noir or something just completely so far away from what you're used to? Because as you say, as artists, we like to explore and push ourselves. And so you get kind of down the track of marketing, or the publisher's like, no, do this again, and as an artist, you're like, well, I kind of want to try this. So anything?
Yeah, I've never been pushed. I've never been forced to write something I didn't want to write.
Okay.
They feel like, we'll only give you the money for this, but not for that. So I'm incredibly fortunate in that, especially because I'm a mid-list writer. I'm not like a bestseller who can like basically come in and waltz in and say whatever, right? And in some ways, being a big bestseller might almost be more restrictive, because then they want more of that same thing that sold well. I don't read it and I don't watch it, but I kind of want to write like a horror novella, because it is so against all of my instincts and vibes. So it would probably really be dark fantasy, and that would be like the hardest. That would be like a hard road for me to go. I did write 2 novellas just to write short, because I write long. For whatever reason that I sprawl, which is whatever. Is it good or bad? I don't know. It's just how it is. So I did write Servant Mage, which is, a 39,000, like 800 word novella. I actually went through, when I finished the final edited draft, I went through and I trimmed out enough words that it would go down below. It was like 300 words to make sure it was below the official novella length. That was hard for me, because I don't conceptualize like that for whatever reason. It's not something I trained myself to, but it's like people say my natural length is the short story, or my natural length is this or that. My natural length is the trilogy. And I don't say that with pride or with despair. It just is. That's conceptually how my brain works. So writing short was a real challenge for me. And I've also never written like a comic script or a screenplay. So that's something else that I thought about.
No, that makes total sense. I mean, speaking of screenplays, and I don't know whether you're allowed to talk about anything, or if anything's in the works at all, but for yourself personally, if you could have something, one of your series on screen, which one would it be and why?
I don't have anything in the works. I'm sorry to say. I would love some of that Hollywood money, whether or not anything ever got made. Just I'm just a writer. Give me the money, right? I hate to sound mercenary, but for that aspect of it. But I don't know. So I can see many different things. I mean, I have a big, huge, epic fantasy that could go on for 7 seasons, that's actually complete, that's filled with all the drama and violence and spirituality and grime of the Middle Ages. I have a really funny, the one with the lawyer dinosaurs has an absolutely, it's kind of Gaslamp era, set in a very alternate Earth, where there are no Northern Europeans, because the Ice Age never allowed those cultures to arise there. So it looks differently, and it has magic, so it's not a true alternate Earth. But it has a really, really funny narrator. And it would be fun with serious elements. The Sun books would make great space opera. I mean, and I have a YA trilogy, which I call American Ninja, Little Women meets American Ninja Warrior in a fantasy setting inspired by Cleopatra's Egypt.
I mean, that's a log line right there for a Hollywood exec. I mean, I work with
I
Hollywood
know.
guys, so that's a
Wouldn't you
package right
think?
there.
Yeah, but it's really my ode to girls who are competitive. Because I don't see enough of that. I'm a lifelong athlete, so that you know, to girls who are competitive and who aren't ashamed of it, who just are.
Yeah.
So, but I had to put all the other stuff in because and it's a trilogy again.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It would be great. It would be fun because you never know if it'll be good or not.
Okay, so we've talked about kind of like, next projects and where you're going with the next book. I guess, this was you're thinking about you can't talk about your next project, so I can't ask you about those.
Although it does have a tangentially climate element, but it's a fantasy, so not in a way that's directly applicable to our modern life.
Yeah. Okay. Did you read Ministry for the Future, which is a climate?
I have it, but I haven't read it yet.
Okay.
It's sitting on my bookshelf over there.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think that was a pretty good one for the climate change thing. Okay. Okay. So you can't talk about the next books, but I guess really important one for me is we talked about you read a lot of nonfiction, and I have to say I'm guilty of not reading a ton of fiction. I have my normal day job, so I'm quite busy. So someone has to really recommend a book to me and say, this is the book you need to read. So do you have kind of like a go-to fiction author that you love to read, or you just shotgun, you like everything?
Like you, I don't have time to read as much fiction as I used to. And also, I remember those days, as a teenager, I just read. I read so much. And even in my 20s, I read so much fiction. And then once I began to publish, it like that line began to go down, how much I read, partly because of being busy, partly because sometimes I couldn't read stuff that was like too much like what I was writing, or for,
Sure.
some other reason. And then partly because I'm afraid I have gotten a little crankier about what I read, in the sense that there's certain things, and not necessarily different things, that I just don't like anymore. And I'm like, life is too short. I'm not enjoying this. I read fiction to enjoy it.
Yeah.
I read nonfiction because I'm so interested in the world. And so nonfiction, assuages my curiosity.
Yeah.
And I feel like it makes me grow and become bigger. But fiction I read to like go to some other place. And if I would say Le Guin. I'm a big fan of Ken Liu. If you like big epic fantasy, that is just the most phenomenal study, I'm going to say, of modernization and cultural change. But it's 4 really big books.
Yeah.
And Fonda Lee's Greenbone Saga, if you haven't read that. Have you read that? It starts with Jade City. She's done something fascinating, which is set it's basically an epic fantasy using epic fantasy tropes, but she's also using the whole John Woo Hong Kong movie vibe.
Yeah.
And because the story starts, I believe, in the equivalent of the 60s, it's set in a secondary world, so it's not directly analogous to it's not our world.
Yeah.
And the only magic is this jade that creates enhanced abilities, but it follows this gangster family, and I hate gangster stories.
Yeah.
And over a trilogy, and so it goes over some decades, and it's just phenomenal. Both because she deals so well with seeing change over time without ever telling you. You watch it happen as it happens. But she also deals with the changes in the family and packs a lot into a trilogy. I would I think it's an incredible accomplishment by her. So I'll just give those three examples.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Okay. Well, then I think coming up to the top of the hour, so last kind of question, which I think is just a funny one, really. So can you think of the best review you ever had and the worst review you ever had? Because I always think the worst are the funniest. Like some people are just triggered for whatever reason, or, you know, really just don't vibe with the work. So can you think of anything?
So it's funny because I always feel like I can get 10 reviews and 9 can be like good reviews and great reviews, but that one negative review is the one I remember 20 years later, where I forgot the other ones. My favorite reviews are the ones where the people really get what I'm doing, where I can tell that they can, you know, sometimes I am aware that some readers only read kind of the surface of what I'm writing. Oh, this is an adventure story and it's got women in it and girls doing stuff. Isn't that nice? Right? But there's a lot going on in my books. And when someone gets that, I love it. And when someone gets, there was a great Goodreads review of the third Cold Magic book. That's the Lawyer Dinosaur books, where the I don't read Goodreads anymore, but I used to. And it was just this long, rambling review. It's like, oh, I can't, you know, I finished the book and then it just went on and on and on and on. And I would, like, when I felt down, I would go read that. And I would say, someone got it. And then some years later, I accidentally met that reader, who's also a writer, it turned out, right? I don't know how we figured it out, but I was like, you wrote that review? Oh my gosh, it got me through some dark times. So she was really happy to hear that. But I have to say, my all-time, and I've gotten bad reviews, but I think my favorite bad review is an email I got. It would have been after book, either 3 or 4 of the Crown of Stars series, which is 7 very fat volumes of early medieval fantasy stuff. And there's a character, one of the main characters is this young man named Elaine, who goes through pretty much every horrible thing you could possibly go to. But at the end of it must be book 3. Sorry, I wrote this so long ago, I can't remember all the details. So at the end of book 3, it seems like, if you read it right, it might seem like he's died, but there's a hint that he hasn't really, that he's just gone somewhere else. In this case, he's been thrown into the past, because I don't care about physics. But I got this email from someone in Quebec, I believe, because English was their second language. Okay. And he wrote, I have just finished book 3. How could you kill Elaine? He is the only reason I read your too long and very boring novel. And I was delighted by that, because he was reading it. Right. Because he was so involved with this one character.
Right. Yeah, that's visceral.
Yeah. So he was mad at me. And anyway, but it was my too long and very boring novel. So I love
that. A visceral reaction is a reaction. Whether they love it or hate it, that's the point. So,
yeah. He was involved. And that means something was working for him, even though the other aspects didn't. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, you know, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me today. For an introvert, you're full of energy. I love it. You just like beam out of the camera there. So thank you so much for speaking with me and for the stuff we're going to do with Alan on the annual meeting. And I wish you all the best with your launch of Furious Heaven and your writing of the